everyone, and welcome back. Today's video is not where I intended to be, but the YouTube algorithm decided to grace me with a video about shoes and the history thereof because, well, I am a shoe historian and I have been studying this for 10 years and have written a lot on it, so it does kind of fit. However, this video is all about the theory that the heel height goes up as the economy goes down. Now, I have heard this theory before. It is not new to this particular video. It has been thoroughly run for about 10 years at this point, and I've just never really bothered to go much further with it. So I decided to watch this video to look at where this theory came from, to research what numbers they were using, how they came to this concept, what the arguments were, and then to go in and do a little bit more research on my end as to what actual trends in heel heights occurred throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. Because though I am very familiar with shoe history, a little more wibbly when it comes to the history of shoes in the latter part of the 20th century. I'm relying more on my own personal memories than I am on actual research, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't mixing things up. So if you have not seen this video, as I said, it is not a new concept. It is based off of mostly a study done in 2011 by IBM. Yes, IBM, the one you're thinking of. And they looked at just the last few years on social media to see what heel heights were referenced on social media. This didn't look at what heel heights were being sold or what heel heights were necessarily being worn, just what heel heights were being referenced. And they found that as the economy dropped during this time, the heel height reference numbers went up. They then extrapolated this data and used both the 1970s platform heels and the 1920s moving into the 1930s as an example of another time that heel height rose as the economy failed. There is a lot to unpack with this concept, as we might now know, more so than we realized back in 2010, 2011, what is on social media is not a very accurate description of real life in any way. So we know to take what people are wearing and talking about on social media with a grain of salt as to what is actually being sold or what is actually being worn by most people. So already we have a very unusual group of numbers that we're pulling from to show that this one small period of time does support that theory. They don't pull numbers for the 1970s, they don't pull numbers for the 1930s as to heel heights. So they are extrapolating this rather than necessarily giving data on it. The other study that I could find that gives a little bit more data looked at 1950 through 2014, and they looked specifically only at Vogue magazines, and they picked out about 20 pairs of shoes a year and then tried to measure out what it looked like the height of the heel was. Again, very interesting, and I think it is useful that they did show that the heel height went up in the 70s, and it did go up again in the late 90s into the early 2000s. As we sort of expected, I'm not disagreeing that heel height goes up and down like that. So are we looking at fashionable shoes, the highest of fashion, the most expensive of fashion, or are we looking at the actual shoes being worn? Two very different answers, probably going to give us two very different results. And though this study is very interesting, it is still a very small number of examples, and it's very difficult to say that that's a large enough sample size when it's really not for being able to prove a large theory like this. That being said, if you watch the video, there's also the issue of the fact that this is meant to be based on US economy and US shoe styles. The US has not been getting their shoe fashions from the US. They've been getting them from France in the earlier part of the 20th century, or from Italy in the latter part of the 20th century. So we need to look at the global economy, not just the US-based economy, in order to understand what's actually happening on an overall scale. Because there are definitely recessions and depressions throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, and they're going to vary depending on what country we're talking about. So already we've started to find that the research itself is rather minimal. A lot of this is based more on hearsay than actual numbers. No one's gone through and found thousands and thousands and thousands of examples from every single year to try and track actual heel changes, because that's really hard to do. And in fact, if you look at just about any shoe catalog or high fashion magazine or anything that sells shoes or advertises shoes, you will find a huge range of heel heights for women's shoes throughout the 20th century. You will find flats or nearly flats for athletic things or for working, laboring, for casual wear such as sandals to the beach. You will find mid-sized heels for the office, for daily wear, for walking, for general everyday fashion. And you will find much higher heels for evening wear or for more formal or fashionable events. So there is always a very wide range, which means that we would have to have a massive sample size in order to get an actual average. Or we would have to specifically pick just high fashion evening shoes or just walking day shoes or whatever it may be. Again, this is a really complicated concept to actually prove in that sense. So what I'm going to try and do is look at when we actually globally had recessions or depressions, and we're going to go through and look at the more average heel height, what we tend to find a lot of examples of, what women were being quoted as wearing regularly, what we actually see as fashionable but everyday sort of fashion, because the most extreme cases I don't feel like are the greatest examples. And that's part of what the argument is, that as the depression occurs, as the economy falls, we turn to fantasy, we turn to unexpected and extreme things in order to have escapism and make ourselves feel better and distracted, which is great, but I'm not sure why high heels signify escapism, because you can also argue that high heels are in reality a return to traditional roles, as we tend to associate high heels with women and feminine roles, and that as high heels come in, women are returning to more feminine-based roles as a need for stability and traditional things. So you can argue it either way pretty easily, in my opinion. But let's take a look at these numbers. Let's look at what shoe heights we find. Let's look at what numbers I can actually find as a reference for what is typical during these years. And let's start off by looking at when we actually had some of those recessions, because there's a lot more than you might think. So we're going to start really in the 20th century, because there were definitely some that occurred throughout the 19th century, but the argument for this tends to really start in the 1920s, so I'm going to start us in the 19-teens just to give us a little bit of a running start into this. We first see, not surprisingly, a recession in 1914 along with World War I. We then see another smaller one in the 1917 to 1921 range. Then we have our much bigger Great Depression that occurs at the very beginning of the 1930s. The dates wander around from 1930 to 32 or 1929 to 33. That's sort of the peak of that particular depression. And then we have another very small mini recession in 1937-38. Another fairly large one that takes place because of World War II, but it happens after World War II in the 1945-46 range. Then we're good for a while. We have a very small one comparative to the others in 1975. That one's only the same size as the one in the late 1930s was. We have a larger one in 1982, a very small one in 1991, a moderate-sized one in 2009, and again in 2020. So there are a lot in there, but the bigger ones, the ones that you need to be aware of more than any others, are the 1930 to 32, the 1945 to 46, and in reality, both the 1975 and 1982 are nowhere near these, or very near to our current ones either, but we'll count those just because that's an area that the study references quite often. And again, 2009 and 2020. So let's start by going back to that 19-teens point, just the very end of the 19-teens. What I have found from looking at a lot of these shoes, studying not only original shoes, but shoe advertisements, shoe references, is that they very often talk about heel heights of around 1.5 to 2 inches, and you do find ones pretty regularly up to 2.5. I don't see that many that go over that particular area, but many shoes are in that range. And in fact, I did find a reference that specified that the heel heights typically ranged from 1 inch to around 2.25 inches for most everyday average shoes for women. And that holds up to what I regularly see, that you do see some that go up to closer to 2.5, but they don't tend to go over that a lot. Again, 19 teens. We move into the 1920s, and this continues, and you regularly see magazines and articles throughout the 1920s keep mentioning that the average heel height tends to be around 1.5 to 1 3/4 for walking shoes. Walking shoes, everyday walking shoes, not for evening wear. You can find plenty of examples of heel heights from the 1920s specifically for evening wear that range anywhere from 2 to 3 inches. This is a very common range, and there are dozens and hundreds of examples of surviving shoes and shoe advertisements in that heel range. It's very normal. And you can also see flats, certainly, but those tended to, again, be for specific purposes, specific activities, or specific foot needs, not the general fashionable style. We move now into the 1930s. So supposedly this study says that the 1920s were very low shoes and that the 1930s went up to very high heels. So we should see, theoretically, a massive difference between this low shoe of around 1.5 to 2.5 inches heel moving into the 1930s. Well, the thing is, I honestly still have a hard time sometimes telling the difference between shoes of the late 1920s and shoes of the early 1930s. There is very little difference. They start to change in terms of the toe shape, and they start to change in terms of elements of the uppers. The heel itself does not dramatically change. We see fewer and fewer curvy Louis heels, and we move more and more towards the Cuban heel, which is a bit more straight. But there's not a dramatic change in heel height. Gradually, over the 1930s, we start seeing some shoes that are over 3 inches. This Cuban heel shape allows for a slightly higher heel. And there's a very gradual change as we move through the 1930s to our evening shoes being more like 3 inches or even up to 3.5 instead of 2.5. So, small changes, yes. The heel height does go up in the 1930s. Yes, there is a depression, but there's nothing dramatic that occurs. It's not super sudden and crazy off the charts heel growth that occurs in the 1930s, neither in the very beginning with the Great Depression, nor in the end with the 1938 recession. The argument that you will hear in the video, as well as in many of these studies, is that the wedge comes in at the very end of the 1930s and is the example of the explosion of heel height. Though the depression occurred at the beginning part of the 30s, and we weren't fully recovered by the end of the 30s, but it was well on its way up by then. So, we were already reaching a bit. The wedge does come in 1939 as a popular heel type that doesn't make a high heel, however. There are low wedges for sports and summer wear. There are high wedges for other types of fashionable wear, evening wear. There are low wedges for evening wear too. So the wedge is all over the place, just like the heel is. There are all sorts of options. And as we move into the early 1940s, those options are incredibly important to all sorts of women because more and more women are moving into the workplace, whether it is an office or a manufacturing job, and they need low heels that are very functional and comfortable to be in working all day. So that's what you're going to see in the streets and being worn everywhere, even if the fashionable heel height has moved up a little bit. So again, the heel height has raised up a smidge there, but nothing too dramatic. We've moved from perhaps around 2 inches in the early 1920s to 2.5 inches by the end of the 20s to 3 inches by the mid-1930s. We can now move into 3.5, and I'm finding some examples as high as 4 inches when we get well into the 1940s. So it is a very gradual growth for this heel height change. And we also start to see, once we reach the end of the 1940s, that the heel not only has gotten generally higher, but it starts to get slimmer, which gives it a very strong effect of looking even higher than it already is. And so as we move into the 1950s, this is when we introduce the stiletto heel. This is when we get that visual of a standard high heel with this tiny little stick underneath. That's our visual of the 1950s, a point where there is decidedly not a global recession or depression at that point in time. And this particular time period is sort of dismissed by the studies, it's dismissed by the video as just a natural occurrence in the adjustment in women's fashion, that we go well up at the beginning of the 1950s in terms of height, and by the end of the 1950s we have reduced our heel height to be much lower. This is when we start to think of that little kitten-heeled pump with the pointed toe. And as we move into the 1960s, this particular heel height drops even lower, and you will very regularly find fashionable shoes and everyday shoes with a shorter, very blocky, stacked style of heel. Think of the standard mod shoe with the square toe and the very square heel. It doesn't necessarily have to be a really flat heel. There are some that are higher, but on average, the heel height has dropped by the time we reach the 1960s and continues on through the 60s in that manner. Once we reach the 1970s, we start to see wedges. The thing here is that platform shoes came in before the 1975 recession. They in fact really started to come in the late 1960s. So we weren't going through a major recession yet at that point, but the platform shoes were already coming in. They were getting wild and crazy and very out there, but it doesn't really necessarily tie to the economy causing it. And I really don't think we can argue that platform shoes cause a recession. That's a bit of a stretch. So we have, yes, wild and crazy shoes. Not that that's what everyone is wearing. If you look at just photographs of people walking down the street in the 1970s, you will see some smaller platform shoes. You see a lot of flats, you see a lot of loafers, you see some just chunky heels. There's a whole range there. But the wild and crazy platforms are really cool, they're really interesting, and for that reason that's what ends up in museums, that's what ends up in fashion magazines, that's what ends up in our mental image because it is so distinct, and we see it everywhere. Museums aren't going to collect a worn out little pair of loafer shoes to put on display. Doesn't matter if that's what everyone wore, they're not pretty, they're not interesting. They're much more likely to choose the really crazy examples to show to the public, and that's what we end up with an image of. So we now have this crazy wild platform shoe that is around, though it's not necessarily worn by everybody. There are more reasonable platforms and more reasonable lower shoes for those that choose them. And then supposedly, according to the video and the research, this starts to go down in heel height when we reach the 80s. I do somewhat agree with this because yes, this is the point where heel height goes down a bit in the sense that a very practical heel is used by a lot of women for their daily wear because of business needs. Many, many women are entering the business world. They want a very standard 1.5 to 2 inch heel. It's everywhere at this point. There certainly are some higher heels for evening wear, and there are certainly lower shoes for other purposes. But this is a really standard, very universal heel height that is more akin to what we saw in, say, the 1920s and early 30s, to what we saw at the late 50s and early 60s. It's just a very practical heel height. Doesn't necessarily match up with changes in economy, though, because, as I said, 1982, we had a bigger recession than we did in 1975, but yet the heel height did not go up there. So it doesn't quite work out. As we move into the 1990s, then, the claim again is that grunge boots and very practical low shoes were in. The economy is doing better, and that these low, practical, clunky boot styles or other such things are what everyone is wearing. Okay, having lived during this time, no. I don't know anyone that wore those. And I'm not saying they didn't exist. There were people that wore grunge. There were people that were part of that group in the 90s. Yes, those were around and those were fashionable for certain groups. However, that was not what the average woman wore. On an everyday level, it certainly wasn't what they were wearing for higher fashion formal events. There were some pretty tall heels at that point in time. And remember, there is actually a slight, very, very slight recession that does occur in 1991. The heel height doesn't really massively jump up at that point in time, though you could certainly argue that heels get very, very high when we reach the 1990s. If you say look at models on the runway, this is when we're getting that stiletto era of the absurdly high stiletto heels with the really pointy toes, and they just look very impractical and unwearable in many ways. This really takes off pretty early in the 1990s, and it continues well into the 2000s, where we somehow just keep getting higher. We add platforms to the bottom of our shoes and attempt that. I definitely wore 4-5-inch heels in the early 2000s. That was when I hit my height of being interested in regular fashion, and I was struggling to wear those high heels, but I couldn't find shorter ones, and I was constantly frustrated by the fact that it was either flats like tennis shoes that I did not want to wear, or all the heels were 4 inches. I wore 4-inch heels around college campus, guys. Like, I went for it, but that was all I could find. There was a brief moment of kitten heels in there somewhere that I was really relieved, and then they just went away again. But the heel height got really high before the economy dropped in 2008. It really wasn't until the 20-teens that I started to find shoes that were a more reasonable height when it came to heels. And I know, yes, platforms are coming back around again. Some crazy shoe styles are coming back around. Whatever the heck is happening with heel shapes now, I don't know. But there's still a wide range of heels available. And if you ask the average woman what she's wearing right now, her answer is probably either nothing around the house or flats. So it's a mixed bag in terms of what women are actually wearing and what's actually available to us. And yes, fashionable high heels got increasingly taller and taller throughout the 1990s into the beginning of the 21st century, and the aughts got really extreme with those heights, but it didn't occur after the 2008 recession. They may have gotten higher still after that point, but they were already trending that direction. It wasn't like we were going down, 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 and then all of a sudden the recession hit and our heel height skyrocketed. We were already on that transitional path. And a similar thing is being argued today, that because the wedge style is coming back around, the 70s are in again, and the late 1930s, early 1940s wedge styles are in again, that we are looking for more extreme escapism out of our recession. And again, I think it's a bit of a leap to decide that wanting high heels means that we are looking for escapism. I can definitely see the craziness in shoes meaning that. I don't think it's necessarily a symptom when it comes to heel height. But again, our heel height has fluctuated constantly throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. And most of the time, the fluctuations have already shifted well before our economic drops. So I don't really see how the economy can have caused that. It might have encouraged it more, maybe, but it was already headed there. So how do we argue that it otherwise wouldn't have happened if we don't see a spike in the following years? So it's a pretty big leap based off of research that just really isn't there. It's feasible to be done, but it would require a lot of information year to year to year to see this trend occurring. We just don't have that sort of thing recorded for a lot of those years, and we can't ignore the fact that heel heights shifted up and down pretty rapidly throughout the mid part of the century when the economy was very stable in comparison to other time periods. So why do heel heights go up and down if there is no economic change, if that's the only reason for it? Or are there perhaps other reasons for heel height changes that have nothing to do with the economy, and it's just that our economic turns seem to be on a similar wavelength to our heel height issues? Either way, no matter what the reasoning is for why sometimes it matches up and sometimes it doesn't, the simple answer is no, the economy does not make heel height go up. It doesn't seem to actually have any effect on the trends that are already taking place. It doesn't force them up or down if they're already headed that direction. So that is my take as a shoe historian. I hope you have enjoyed this very rapid look at shoes throughout the 20th and 21st century. There are some crazy examples out there, and it's not always because of depressions that we end up with some of the weirdest shoes.